Hello, this is Bryan Caplan speaking to you from the Salem Center at the University of Texas in beautiful, sunny, and almost mask-free Austin. Today, we have a very special guest, the great Richard Hanania of the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology. Is right here with me in Austin. Richard is stunned by the lack of mask wearing because normally he is hanging his hat in oppressive California, but right now he is breathing the free Texas air, which is a great place for us to have our podcast, which will begin with, well, we're actually going to begin with a little bit on Richard Hania's biography. You may not yet know him, but if you don't, after today you will, and you're going to be hearing his name a lot in coming years. It's the general insider consensus. All right, but he also has a brand new book out, his first book, which is called Public Choice Theory and the Illusion of Grand Strategy. But why don't we just go right into it? Thank you very much for joining us, Richard.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Brian.
Richard, you have had a remarkable path in life. From what I have heard, you were a high school dropout. How did you get from there to where you are today?
I mean, it's not that remarkable. You make it sound, it's not like it's that exciting. I mean, I was a bad high school student. I didn't like school very much. I dropped out of high school. I went to community college for a few years, transferred to a real college, and then did graduate school. So it's really the path is there. It's just I don't think it's actually unusual as people think, because there was a high school dropout, a guy who ended up going to Yale as an undergrad. I remember he wrote a book on the experience. So maybe it is rare because he wrote a book, but at least one other person has gone to some kind of elite institution from being a high school dropout. Somebody told me the other day that they have maybe it was you. They have a thing in Berkeley where they have a fellowship for ex-felons. And so they have, so it's, I didn't get in on like a felon affirmative action program or anything, but yeah.
All right. Well, you've carved out a deeply untraditional career path for yourself, yet you still have degrees from top schools. In hindsight, have your academic credentials done anything at all for your success?
Have the credentials, or the studying. So,
what are your credentials?
So I have a JD from the University of Chicago Law School. I have a PhD in political science from UCLA, and I was a fellow at Columbia for a few years.
All right. And did any of that even matter for what you're doing, or could you have just fast forwarded through all of that, been an autodidact, and been exactly where you are today?
So it's an interesting. So like what I actually learned, I mean, learning statistics was very important. I could have done that, on my own. It was probably not a cost efficient way to go to graduate school to learn, basic statistics that you need to do political science and, just, psychology, social science stuff that I do. But I don't know. I mean, my sort of success, I think, depends on getting attention, people thinking I'm smart. I mean, people like my writing and they recommend it, and then other people like it, and there's the social proof thing. Did I need sort of academic, decent academic credentials to get my foot in the door? I don't know. Like, it's hard to say. I mean,
so it's possible that you could have just skipped all this.
It's possible I could have, done this when I was, 18 or 20, if I had the emotional and maturity and, intellectual development to do it.
All right. So you've got a new book out on foreign policy. To repeat, the title is Public Choice Theory and the Illusion of Grand Strategy. It's available for sale on Amazon. There is an exorbitantly priced hardcover and a plausibly priced paperback, or not paperback, ebook rather, a plausibly priced ebook. So, I mean, obviously everyone's going to want the hardback, but maybe some people who are on the verge of starvation will want the ebook instead. But anyway, so, and most of your early work is in foreign policy, so let's just start there. So your book attacks two things. First of all, the illusion of grand strategy, and secondly, the unitary actor model. So could you just start off by telling us what is the illusion of grand strategy and what is the unitary actor model?
So the unitary actor model is basically the idea that, you can talk about a state like the way you talk about an individual. Individuals have goals, they have desires, they have preferences, they act upon them. And this is sort of the foundation of, microeconomics, and rational choice and, all kinds of things. And so that's basically what international relations does, to simplify things to a large extent, and historically what the field has done is that it has basically used that assumption to describe states. So when one country is deciding what to do with another, whether to sign an agreement or to go to war.
France decided it needed colonies.
Yeah, exactly. France decided at some point it needed colonies, yes. And the study of grand strategy is a sort of a corollary of that is that it's trying to explain, and really it's almost not even a real like a trying to explain. It's sort of like a normative debate, actually, as much as it is trying to explain anything of what the grand strategy of any particular country is. So grand strategy is generally defined as economic, military, and diplomatic means going towards accomplishing the same goals. If you have that, you have a grand strategy. If you don't have that, you don't have a grand strategy. Because I don't believe in the unitary actor model, which the theory of grand strategy depends on, I'm skeptical of grand strategy as a concept itself.
Now, it seems to me that you could look at one individual and say, oh, that guy, he's a unitary actor, but he does not have a grand strategy. In fact, I'd say that describes almost all human beings.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if we could do the same thing for countries. So we could drop the illusion of grand strategy and say, yeah, countries don't have any big long-term plan, but still say that each U.S. president has great autonomy to pursue his personal and plausibly ill-considered foreign policy agenda. So what's wrong with that story where basically every time we get a new president, we get a new unitary actor who acts on his own confused and short-sighted ways, but he still is one man who has not a plan, but it's one person who has something he's trying to do, and then he gets out of office, and then a new guy shows up, and he's got something he's trying to do, which could be totally different from the previous guy.
Yeah, so there's two authors, Dustin Tingly and Helen Milner, who basically they make this argument that the person of the president basically solves the problem of having a fragmented government. But they also they make the argument, and I think this is right, that because the president has most control over the military compared to everything else, that leads to a highly militarized American foreign policy. And so, that is true that the president has, a lot of discretion in military affairs, even when he really, wants to do something. The sanctions regime gives him a lot of ability to basically sanction. So you have the diplomatic part, you have the economic part, you have the military part. But besides, mostly with the exception of the military part, where Congress really usually doesn't push back, other interest groups have a big role to play, and they have a role to play in Congress. And the executive branch itself, one thing I point out in the book, is itself its own interest group, because what presidents do often depends on what information they receive, what incentives the bureaucracy is creating for them. Things like damaging leaks, or presenting selective information, but then presenting selective information to the general public. So if you actually study, there's no reason you might not think, intuitively that this stuff would be very important. But when you study actual instances of American foreign policy, you do see that influence, like why Obama escalated in Afghanistan, why Trump escalated in Afghanistan. It was the same story. It was overwhelming pressure from the Pentagon, from the generals, from the people in the government. You can get something closer to a strategy. I don't know about grand strategy, right? Something that explains how the U.S. interacts with the world. But there's still interest groups. There's still a lot going on.
I mean, perhaps we could say that the kind of person who becomes president is not someone who's going to keep his own counsel. If you imagine putting a randomly selected person in the presidency, you might get someone like you, and the Pentagon would say, we desperately have to do this, President Hanania, President Hanania, and then you say, no, we're not.
Yeah.
Stand down, and then maybe what you say happens, but the kind of person that actually gets the job in the real world is not someone of such steely fiber. Could that be the story?
Yeah, that's definitely part of the story. I mean, there's a selection process where you get to, before somebody gets to being president, and what are you selecting for? You're selecting for people, not people who have grand strategies, or people necessarily who have strong ideological commitments, where they can take advantage of the power that they technically have, right? There's certain, it's often a matter of will, and that's not what we select for in our political system. We select for people who are good at politics. And what does being good at politics means? I mean, it means going along with powerful interest groups.
Go along to get along.
Yeah. So the president's power is, in theory, nearly unlimited in foreign policy. In practice, it tends to be a lot more restricted. And Trump was such an interesting case because he's so, I think, psychologically different, and his background was very different from other presidents, but actually ended up having a pretty conventional Republican foreign policy, despite some weird eccentricities. That probably helps the theory that even Trump had to sort of be like a politician to succeed in politics.
So in your book, you consistently describe voters as rationally ignorant and especially rationally ignorant about foreign policy. Now, I actually have a book that you cite several times. Thank you very much. The Myth of the Rational Voter, Why Democracies Choose Bad Policies. And this book argues that you're overly optimistic because I say voters are worse than ignorant. Sure, they're ignorant, but they're also deeply irrational. Do you disagree that voters are irrational? And do you need voter rationality to make your story work?
Well, I mean, I think I agree with your book, but they're rational in the sense that they're doing what makes sense for themselves, which is to be irrational, right?
Yes,
that's why
so there's epistemic rationality, and then you could say there's instrumental rationality.
Okay, so that's instrumental.
Yes.
They're instrumentally rational and epistemologically irrational.
Right. Like, for example, in the book, you talk about how voters' rational ignorance means that when there's classified information, they really have no choice but to trust the government. And the rational actor approach would say, well, wait a second, I have a choice. Yeah. If you say, sorry, I can't tell you that's classified, a person could say, well, if it's classified, then I don't believe you. And like, if you won't share the information, then I'm not going to support you. Either put up or shut up.
Yeah. I hope I didn't give that impression of the book because I don't think it's, that would be giving too much credit to the epistemological rationality of the voter. So no, I don't believe that. I think it's more like yours.
So the voters are gullible. It's not just poor me. I don't have the information.
It's gullible, but they also want to. I mean, it they also they. One of the most consistent things about voters is they dislike foreigners, or they dislike foreigners relative to people in their own country. So what are you doing in foreign policy when you're trying to push sort of a more militarist or trying to sanction somebody, militarist direction, or trying to sanction somebody? You're trying to get them to think bad things about foreigners, and you're not going against the grain there. I mean, you're basically playing to their tendencies.
Mm-hmm. So for me, maybe the most eye-opening chapter in the book was your chapter on sanctions. And what's striking is that you mentioned that people think of sanctions as doing nothing. And that was definitely kind of where I was when I started saying, oh, yeah, there's these sanctions. I never really thought about them. But you argue that actually sanctions over the long run can do more damage than a war and definitely kill a lot more people. Yeah. So could you just give us a quick introduction to what is it that we ought to know about sanctions that hardly anybody does?
So sanctions run the gauntlet from basically just shutting down a country from the global economy, which means no American can do business with them. No foreigner can do business with them without being shut out of the American economy too. So you're basically shutting them out from the global economy. So, there's so the most extreme cases are like North Korea, Syria, now Venezuela. And basically, it's really amazing. Like banks will want to have nothing to do with anybody. So there's reports of people working for international organizations because it's like called the Syrian Relief Fund or something, because they have Syrian in their name, they can't open bank accounts, right? It's that extreme. So you can imagine what the people in Syria are going through. And this applies to everything. Now they say there are humanitarian exceptions, which means you can't have an economy and you can't have any economic growth, but we'll let in a little bit of charity, which, that's the point is the suppression of economic growth. It's not necessarily, how much charity you provide. And often you can't even get the charity. Like right now in Afghanistan, they can't even send the charity to the Taliban.
So why don't we just break it down a little bit more? So first of all, what actually do we know about what sanctions do to sanctioned countries?
They do terrible things. You can imagine if you're cut off from the global economy.
No, but you got some numbers in the book, so I want numbers.
Oh, okay, you want numbers. So I mean, the numbers are always disputed and they're very hard to study. And so I can give you like a few examples. So there was one example that was just it was looking at basically the Trump administration did total sanctions on Venezuela when they tried to recognize the Guaido government, and they tried to say Maduro's government is no longer legitimate. In 1 year, this is based on surveys of people in Venezuela. They calculated 40,000 excess deaths in 1 year. Right? There was one estimate from international relief organization that had North Korea, and it was looking, I think, at one disease, within a 1 year period, they couldn't get some medicine or something, or 1 or 2 year period or something like that. It was a few thousand deaths in North Korea. Right? This is just a tiny fraction of what sanctions are doing. There were numbers that the Iraq sanctions in the 1990s killed hundreds of thousands. I think the better research came out later and showed that was exaggerated, but it's probably in the tens of thousands, maybe close to 100,000. And so, we're talking, serious body counts often much more than what the wars cause.
Right, and then effects on GDP. I remember you had at least one paper, possibly others, that had estimates of that.
Yeah, it's 1 or 2% per year. Compounding.
Compounded. That's important. Could you explain compounding?
Compounding is like compound interest. You get 7% a year, and then you add, and then if you take off, right, it's the same thing, the same concept. And so this is. I mean, basically, if you want to, if you're like a humanitarian and you're looking at American foreign policy, I think you shouldn't be thinking about providing more aid. I don't think you should be even the wars are not the main priority here. The main priority should be the sanctions regime.
Right. So that's what sanctions do to the country that's affected. But what do sanctions accomplish, according to our best understanding?
Our best understanding is they don't really accomplish much. So there was, some data sets that were used to argue the sanctions could accomplish something. Robert Pape at the University of Chicago, and I go into the debates here, took those apart. I don't trust this kind of political science where we create data sets and we say what are the intentions and what are the causes between this and that. I think that's sort of a scientism more than it is science. But I mean, the burden is on those who want to destroy the economy of nations and kill tens of thousands of people, and we don't really have strong evidence that sanctions work.
It means there really any example of sanctions actually causing the local population to rise up in rebellion and overthrow the government?
Not that extreme, no.
Yes.
Like that's
So although that's often the official rationale, right?
That's the official rationale, or semi-official rationale. So you could point to like Myanmar, where they democratize for a short period of time, and the people will say that's because of the sanctions. Who knows? It's hard to determine these things. Iran, negotiating the Iranian nuclear deal. People say that that's sanctions, but we pulled out of that. So you see sort of the irrationality in these policies. Like it didn't work in Myanmar in the long run, and Iran we pulled out of the deal anyway. And so there's very very few examples of this. I mean, there's there's also the idea is that they'll be so poor that they'll get desperate and the government will lose its legitimacy. There's also an idea that when they want to justify other things they're doing in foreign policy, that as countries get richer, they overthrow the government and become democratic. So it seems like, they grab whatever theory they can.
Overthrow or just get soft?
The idea that the sort of modernization theory is that people get wealthier and then eventually you democratize, right?
Right, but that could come from the leaders to say, "All right, well, we're rich. We're not going to massacre
whatever
people anymore."
whatever form regime change takes, right? Whether it's pressure from below or top or whatever. But in the modernization theory, I mean, they put a central role for the people and pressure from below.
So there are a lot of striking facts in public choice theory and the illusion of grand strategy. For me, what probably stays with the most is that you confirm what I had heard a number of places, which is that for the last three major American wars, namely Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, the U.S. just really didn't have anyone in the administration whose job it was to figure out what comes after we win. To me, that would be the most minimal part of any grand strategy is, okay, well, what do we want? We want the regime to be like this. So how do we get there? Well, we overthrow them. Whereas it seems more like all the brain power goes into the military conquest, and then there's no brain power left to figure out what happens.
Well, actually, I think the military doesn't even go into the military. The brain power goes into selling the war.
All right. And well, we do win. The U.S. does win pretty well when it deploys.
Well, I mean, look at its opponents.
Yeah, all right, that's fair. So maybe it wasn't that well planned, and it's just the overwhelming superiority of force.
Yeah, I think that's so the U.S. basically didn't have the soldiers in Iraq to secure all the WMD sites, the suspected WMD sites that they thought would be in there. So I don't know how well this stuff planned. There happened not to be WMD, so they got lucky there. And then the main museum of the country, which had all these ancient artifacts, got looted because there just wasn't enough troops to even keep the peace the next morning. So yeah, I don't even know if there's a lot of effort going in. I mean, the military, they do, they are given a mission and they can go do that. And so there's planning there. But yes, you're right. Libya, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Iraq is the most striking and it's the most important because basically there were two factions within the government. The neocons who wanted the war, these are the Cheneys and the Fights and Wolfowitz. They were basically friends with Ahmed Shalabi, and basically what their critics say is they just wanted to give the country over to Shalabi. They didn't care about democracy. They thought he was a liberal guy who would do good things, but basically there was no. They didn't want any kind of nation building. Now the State Department was more skeptical of the war. But if we did go to war, they want it to be nation building because they're, liberal, good governance types. You can't just give it over to a dictator or just leave them in chaos, right? So that their idea was basically no war, but if war, then, permanent occupation, basically, or enough occupation, they wouldn't say that, enough occupation to help the government be formed. And what happened was you'd think you'd adopt maybe one of these and that would be a grand strategy, but it was like Bush just, decided to sort of listen to the first faction and go to war. And then like a month after the war, it looked like they were going to, stay with that plan and just basically give the government over to Shalaby and the other Iraqi exiles.
But didn't the U.S. have to go and tell all its allies there were going to be democratic elections quite soon in order to get them on board?
Well, I mean, they didn't get. I don't think so. No, I don't think that was a. I mean, you could.
So that was not a key part of assembling the coalition of the willing. Was promising everyone there were going to be free and fair democratic elections ASAP.
No, there might have been somebody might have said something like that at one point, but there was no. There was no like thinking within the, I've read all the, the memoirs and the reporting. There was no like consideration like, oh no, we need democracy because the Poles and the British are going to be bad because we promised them this. There doesn't seem to have been. I mean, there were really no major allies besides the British. So, I mean, the other ones were just Eastern European countries who were basically at that point happy to be friends with the U.S. and just going along with whatever America would do.
So the one that seemed craziest in the book was Libya. Because here you have the case of Muammar Gaddafi, who actually, of his own free will, complies with all the requests to end his WND program and to help with the war on terror. And as far as I can tell, it's generally agreed that he was true to his word and did everything he was going to say. And then the U.S. goes and overthrows him anyway, which leads the North Koreans to say, well, we're never going to give you our nukes because look at what happened to Muammar. Does that sound, so you could elaborate on that?
Yeah, exactly. So just to finish Iraq, so they overthrow the government. Bush listens to the first action, but then like a month later, they everyone in the government expects that they're just going to hand it over to Shalaby. So they weren't thinking about democracy. But then he has a meeting with Paul Bremer, who was like an old State Department guy, and he wanted the
he is Bush.
Bremer has a meeting with Bush, and then Bush basically changes his mind and says, "Okay, Bremer, you do whatever you want." And this is a month after the invasion, right? Just he never really thought about what was going to happen. It happened through inertia, and then he just gives it to Bremer, and then you get the occupation. You get the the U.S. ambitiously trying to build civil society, right? I don't know if I quoted the book, but Bremer's always like, we're not going to leave until there are labor unions and women's rights and journalism and free press and newspapers, and he just lists like 20 different things. And so that's Iraq. I mean, you clearly no grand strategy here. Libya, it's exactly the same. It was held up, by people who were apologists for the Bush administration. The idea was that Gaddafi saw the U.S. was serious about like dealing with bad actors, so he got rid of his WMDs. He has like dinner with Condoleezza Rice. He's accepted as sort of a coming back into the
family of nations.
The family of nations, exactly. And and like
what a family.
And also he's I don't think I talk about this much at all, but he's also helping clamp down on immigration from Africa, right?
Yeah, right.
He's stopping them all, the refugees, which Europeans don't want, right? So like from the perspective of Western countries, there's a lot, to be said for Gaddafi and his regime, right? And then the Arab Spring comes along, and it's basically, if you look at the reporting, it's like the Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, was skeptical. Obama was sort of wavering. And then you had like Hillary Clinton and Susan Rice and Samantha Power, who were just really into this sort of idea of global leadership and humanitarian intervention. And things were moving fast. I mean, we're talking days and weeks. And the Europeans, for whatever reason, like the French particularly, want to do something. And there was no alternative government. There was just nothing that could potentially replace it. And so, this is like, ridiculous in the context of what the U.S. was, holding up what they were pointing to Libya to supposedly prove. Of course. And then from the context of just, the future of that country, there was just no plan or no even, I don't think there was even like a theoretical way you got from like overthrowing the government to not having a civil war. And Libya's been having intermittent civil wars, for the last 10 years. So it's a terrible situation. No, they did not think much about it.
Right, and it also sent exactly the wrong message to every other dictator on earth.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a funny story. So the North Korea, there's reports that North Koreans were thinking about Libya. This was Evan Osnos, I think, in the New Yorker has reported this. And at one point, John Bolton, when Trump is negotiating with Kim Jong Un, when Trump was president, John Bolton says, we want denuclearization. We want it on the Libyan model, right? And I was teaching some international relations class. Like, why do you think John Bolton said this? And they're sort of puzzled. And I think, okay, you're John Bolton. You love war. You love hawkishness, right? You're trying to sabotage. If you're trying to sabotage Trump's negotiations and make sure he's not going to make a deal with Kim Jong Un, these are the exact words you would use. So that's I don't have any proof of this, but my theory is that Bolton basically wanted to throw a wrench in Trump's plans to make friends with Kim Jong Un, and he probably did a good job of it. I mean, they were taken aback by that. He went to Yale Law School. I mean, Bolton is not an idiot, so I think he knew the implications of the Libya model.
So you argue that bad U.S. foreign policy will continue until we change the incentives of interest groups. But isn't there a catch-22? So don't you really need a unitary actor or some major shift in public policy to change interest groups' incentives?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the last chapter is basically about how you can potentially change foreign policy, right? And I don't, if I was going to say like what are the odds that it's going to actually change? I think that catch-22 is real. I mean, I think that, despite what I do, maybe I can convince people, maybe not. I think the incentives are what they are. I think, because of the extent to which I put sort of emphasis on inertia, if you have a president who, if you do by some accident or some, a quirk of history, get some president who is ideologically committed to scaling back American commitments or even taking on new commitments, whatever he does is going to be sticky because the system is, very based on inertia. Like when we had troops in Afghanistan, the easiest thing was to keep them there. When we don't have troops in Afghanistan, nobody's going to dare send them back, or, nobody's sane, hopefully. I think a historical contingency matters a lot here, and the president's power, it's theoretical if it could be made real, and, there's no reason to rule that out. You could get a major change in foreign policy.
All right, Richard, you run the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology. What does mainstream political science get right about partisanship?
So I think there's a few big findings from political science that basically explain, are consistent with the data and explain, I think, are intuitively appealing to people who just are casual observers of politics. Effective polarization, the idea that the parties and people of different ideologies do not like each other, and that's increasing. Often, there the things that people say something is getting worse. More often than not, there's not a lot of evidence behind that. Things are just as bad, or maybe they were worse in the past. Now, this is worse. This is like Republicans don't like Democrats and vice versa, much more than in the past. And this is driving our politics to a great extent. I mean, I think most political scientists understand that they have a limited faith in sort of the capabilities of voters to care and to process complex information. I think that's been the standard in political science for a really long time. The ideology is sort of the extent to which people have ideology. It's very flexible and can depend on partisan cues and how you phrase a question and all kinds of things.
So Republicans will support price controls if Nixon does it.
Exactly. They're not. They probably not abortion. Right, not abortion rights. If even if Trump said it, I don't think that most Republicans would support abortion rights. So there are some limits, and there are some organic concerns that people have. But yeah, I mean, that's.
How about just predictors of partisanship? Mainstream political science get that right?
Predictors of like which side you're on?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, basically the idea is
namely.
that. What's that?
Namely, what are those predictors?
Race, gender, things like personality have a smaller influence. Like moral intuition. That's almost cheating. I think looking at moral intuitions because it's so closely tied to politics. It's saying okay, it's like morals predict morals. So that's not very impressive. But yeah, the race, gender, sexual orientation, religiosity is a huge one. I don't think that one is people become religious because they want to be Republican. My experience with people tells me that's something innate that comes before and then determines the politics later.
Right. And similarly, what does mainstream political science get right about ideology?
It's sort of it's the same thing. I mean, that people don't really have most of the time much of my ideology. I think at the elite level, there's a tendency to downplay it for elite actors. I think ideology can be very important, but basically, I think that political science gets ideology right at the mass level.
All right, presumably you would not have started your center if you thought that mainstream political science had already figured out everything important about partisanship and ideology. What are the main consensus views that you reject?
So the name partisanship and ideology, I mean, I think our sort of mission has become much broader than that. So it's like the name is, the name was chosen, but even so, the name is a bit of a reproach to the existing field because you're saying that we need a whole center to advance this. Yeah,
it isn't settled. There's important questions that we don't understand yet.
I think political scientists understand how partisanship works and how much it shapes the mass public. I don't think they're very self-aware of how partisanship and ideology basically shape their own way of looking at politics. So there's something. I'll give you an example. So I took a class at UCLA. I got my PhD there in political science on political psychology. Every week was, something, what's wrong with Republicans, like racism and small government, for example, racism and anti-immigration sentiment, the browning of America and French. Like, okay, there's something there. I don't think that stuff was necessarily wrong. But you can, and there's stuff on the authoritarian personality. And this is supposedly something right-wingers have. Yeah. And somebody actually came along and showed that you can design a scale where you just change the authority figures from cops to professors and scientists, and suddenly left-wingers are more authoritarian. So why did we have that authoritarian scale? Why was it applied to the right? I mean, that's obviously a partisan. There's partisan reasons for that.
Yeah, there's actually a great paper by J.J. Ray called "The Old-Fashioned Personality," where he reinterprets the entire literature on the authoritarian personality to say it's actually an old-fashioned personality, and he uses it to explain a number of puzzling things, such as people who score high in the F scale will endorse racist views, but they're personally nice to people of the group that they say bad things about, which is very old-fashioned. Like, you don't, someone comes up, you offer them a glass of lemonade regardless of the race.
And even how they define racist. So there's something called the racial resentment scale. I mean, if anybody's listening, go Google racial resentment scale. It's basically just like a Tom Sowell book. Like, if you summarize a Tom Sowell book in bullet point format, that's the racial resentment scale. They'll say this predicts Republicanism. Yeah, no kidding, right there. Those are conservative talking points.
So one thing that an academic consensus can do is actually say things that are wrong, but another thing that it can do is just fail to ask certain questions.
Exactly.
So what are the top questions that mainstream work on partisanship and ideology is neglecting, and that you over at your center are asking?
Exactly. So the the political science, and it's to a large extent the field, and especially what gets a lot of press, what the media, likes to report on, and what, entrepreneurial political scientists can sell very well. It's basically there's often something wrong with conservatives, their thinking or their morality or their, intuitions. Yes, like all humans, there are. And, 90% of the time or more, you can find an equivalent thing on the left. Science denial, if you read a question about science, a paper on science denial, it's probably going to ask about global warming. Nobody's going to make a scale of science denial. It's going to ask about male-female differences, right? Same thing with prejudice. I mean, liberals are, one of the interesting findings is that basically if you do something like a trolley test where you throw one fat man to save people on conservatives will show no bias on race, but liberals will towards helping blacks at, the expense of white. And then they'll say, oh no, it's different kind of racism, whatever. And
what about stereotype accuracy?
Stereotype. So
you actually published a piece on that, didn't you?
Lee Jussom, who's sort of the father of the study of stereotype accuracy.
Talk about science denial.
Nate Honeycutt. People, the stereotypes, all stereotypes, pretty much, most stereotypes at least are true.
Not just true, but like super accurate compared to almost anything else in social science is what Jussom shows.
Yeah, exactly. If you want, you ask the average person what their stereotypes about groups is, you can rely more on that than a political scientist trying to explain, those things. So it's so like you'll see this, like, conservatives believe in stereotypes, therefore they are racist, and like it's often just true things. I mean, it's literally they're saying they're bad because they believe in true things. The other funny thing, I mean, you have these democracy scales, right? And they're so stupid. I mean, I had a Substack on Freedom House, and like it's like, oh, the Supreme Court ruled against government labor unions' forced collection of dues. This hurts you in our democracy score. It's how is that democracy? So if you look at like the political science sort of topic category on Twitter, it's like a good measure of what the political scientists who are getting the most attention now are doing. And, I tried to parody this, and like half the people thought it was real, where I made like a democracy scale and showed it just going like this, and I showed racism going like that, racism going to democracy. And everyone's like, are you serious? We're like, what is this stuff? And people are like, I can't tell, because it's the exact same thing that every political scientist on Twitter is doing. This is not only a partisanship, this is scientism. This is, I think, another problem with the field.
So there are many theories that try to explain the deep, durable difference between left and right. I'm going to go through a bunch of them and then just ask you what you think about each of them. All right. So what do you think about the theory the left cares more about the poor and powerless?
I think that's that's a theory that flatters the left. I don't think it's true. I mean, something I think you pointed out is the most powerless in the world are people in third world countries who are living in grinding poverty. The left cares about them probably more than the right, but doesn't really care about them, compared to poor Americans. If you look at something like the pro-life movement, they'll claim that for themselves.
Sure.
They speak for those who don't have a voice, and that has not always been.
Who could be more poor and powerless than a fetus?
Yeah, exactly. And historically, like something like free market economics, and say free market economics and like pro-gun and like pro-life, that's a weird combination. I don't know if you found that many parts in in history you find ideologies that combine those things. So I think I think that both ideologies of both sides are sort of a mishmash of different things, and I don't think something like one side cares more about group X, and maybe like race X or something, but no, not in those terms.
So what do you think about personality theories such as that the left is more open and less conscientious, while the right is less open and more conscientious?
There is something to those, but if you look at those correlations, they're not as they're not that strong. I do think there is something, and this is another thing that political science hasn't asked. I do think there is something to people's faces, physiognomy. Well, how do you pronounce it? Is it?
Physiognomy. I think.
Yeah. I know how to spell it, not pronounce it. So I mean, so somebody actually did a study where you can tell by people's faces like how racist they are. Racist in the political sciences, and it was very ironic because this is something that liberals think is a very scary thing to research. So if you're going to do that for like crime or something, which people used to believe 100 years ago, they don't believe now. I don't think that they've changed that for good reason. I think they've changed that for our views have changed for reasons of political correctness. But it's funny because there was a picture of the professor who did this study, and you just look at him, he's a liberal. And I think that like sort of there are these sort of traits. I think like testosterone in men seems to me like a clear one, sort of like where you are on the spectrum. If you're on the spectrum, that seems to matter too. So actually, I'm actually I'm more optimistic for like these personality things to have predictive power. I think the ones people have focused on haven't necessarily been the most important.
All right, and this one is a bit obscure, but it comes right out of your alma mater, UCLA. So Sedanius's social dominance orientation theory. Are you? We could skip it if you're not familiar with it.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. Yeah. We ran into it when I was studying political.
You didn't have a class with Sedanius?
No, I don't think he wasn't there. I think he was at Harvard at the time. It's just another one of these things where you have the. It was actually I forget the details on this one, but I think it was like pretty. It was like those questions are almost like trolling. So if you look at them, they're like strong should like step on the weak. It's like stuff like that. And like I think like
what's the right answer?
I think people are conservative if they But Sedanius connects it to like this whole theory of like sort of a natural group conflict. He basically believes like races are naturally competing. I don't think I think Manker Olson's theory of groups like should make people skeptical of these broad interest groups like rationally fighting with each other. So yeah, I reject that framework. I don't think there's much there.
All right, how about survive thrive theory, sometimes associated with Scott Alexander?
So I read the blog post. So the idea is when you are basically poor and you don't have a lot, you just want to survive, and that means I guess not welcome foreigners and not be very careful and just try to get your genes to the next generation. And if you want to, if you're a little bit wealthier, maybe you're more outgoing and open. Is it basically like that?
Yeah. So I think what he says is that the conservatism is what you get when you're optimized for surviving, and liberalism is what you get when you're optimized for thriving. Yeah, so like this is a story where there's just a natural tendency to go from poor conservative societies to rich leftist societies.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things one of our research fellows, Zach Goldberg, has found is that mental illness has a very strong correlation with the left. So if left wing is optimized for thriving, I don't know by what measures liberals are necessarily thriving.
Like one of my criticisms is that during wars, societies almost always move left in terms of having enormous government role in the economy, which is exactly the opposite of what survive theory predicts.
I don't know if for Scott Alexander, but when I
war socialism.
When I hear that, I think of social conservatism versus liberalism. I don't think about size of government. And
I think he's packing it all together.
Okay. Yeah. When I think that when I hear this theory, like my prior is that people understand that the economics thing is malleable, like small government I don't think there's in there. I mean, or like another counterexample I would say is pro-choice, pro-life. I think that his theory should be that when you're poor, then it's like board anyone we can't afford, and when you're rich, then it would be like every person's entitled to a place at our table. Yeah. And that's, of course, is exactly the opposite of how it goes in the U.S. and probably most countries. I mean, my intuition is that like your views on abortion or homosexuality, for example, are less contingent on sort of are basically less easy to manipulate based on just simple cues than your views on economics. I don't think people feel economics very close, and there, except for the stuff that like everyone agrees on, which like don't sell your organs and stuff like that. So yeah, I guess it depends on exactly what we're trying to find. And so if you apply Scott Alexander to his theory to social issues, I mean, there is that correlation that's very interesting, that as countries get wealthier, they do sort of have more, liberal attitudes. And it's hard because it's confounded by a lot, because, I mean, we have a global culture, right? And so...
right, and I also say this is all based upon throwing out Marxist-Leninist regimes as being really real leftists, because they were very socially conservative, except at the very beginning of the Soviet Union, they had a year or two of anomia, but afterwards, family, every kid in a family, and wearing blue jeans, no, it's a gulag for you.
Well, but when you say they were poor, so they're surviving.
Yeah. So they were poor. They were poor. No, but they were extreme leftists.
So you have to say they're okay. Yes, you can't.
Given that they're leftists, you should expect them to be super open-minded about sexual orientation and so on. I mean, of course, there's plenty of people saying, "Oh, well, the Soviet Union was so great for women." It's like, oh yeah, it's real great. They have to do all the work of a traditional woman plus also have a job. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the most charitable, interpretation is not going back in time, and I think from a political philosophy perspective, unquestionably, communist regimes are left wing, right? Yes. I think the most charitable interpretation is he's basically just trying to explain abortion and gays, and from that, like libertarians are here, and like they're and liberals, and then communists and social conservatives are here. I think that's what he's trying to do.
Perhaps
I shouldn't.
One must wonder when you have to throw out almost all the data, and especially the most extreme data. Like, we're going to figure out how to explain leftism, and Mao and Stalin and Lenin don't count.
Exactly.
All right, and now, last one. This one is probably the least well known, although it's near and dear to my heart. I call this my simplistic theory of left and right. Yeah. And my simplistic theory just says this. The left is anti-market and the right is anti-left. And again, of course, this does not mean that all leftists are communists, but rather that the common thread for almost all leftists is they all feel high resentment for markets, such that they can't bear to go and give a paragraph of praise for markets without putting in something negative. And on the other hand, for the right, there isn't anything actually that they're that enthusiastic about, necessarily, that they can all agree they're enthusiastic about, but what they can agree on is they do not like those leftists. And so I say, like, if you just imagine gathering together a giant conference of 200 years worth of international leftists, 200 years worth of international rightists, and say, write a statement that almost all of you can agree on. on. I say that the statement of the pan-leftist group would be a bunch of complaints about markets, and the statement of the pan-rightist group would be a bunch of complaints about leftists. So what do you think about it?
I think that when you put it like that, that is actually a good point. If you are just looking for like a few paragraphs that all basically left, but what about, would rightists, most rightists, like, fascists and so forth, I think, and then like, so monarchists, I think there would be a lot of complaints in markets too, but maybe more complaints about leftists, right? So it's not necessarily
right. Well, what I say is, among rightists, there are plenty of anti-market rightists, but that varies. You're allowed to have a wide range of views on markets and still be in the right, but you can't go around saying, "Oh, leftists, I think they're real cool. Yeah. They're such great people."
Well, why not just characterize it as concern for equality, and equality it's always selective, always on one dimension. So it was like, under Stalin, they thought about equality between workers, right? And the capitalists or whoever the owners are. And now they think about equality between races and don't care necessarily as much about inequality economically relative to between races, right? Why not just say concern with equality and then markets get in the way?
Well, I guess I would say that a lot of conservatives say I care very strongly about equality under the law, equality of opportunity.
Yeah.
And so again, you sort of have to assume the leftist view of what kind of equality counts,
right?
Count in order to do the classification, which is kind of what I don't want to do.
Yeah, and Freddie DeBoer, who I just interviewed, told me that equality is not central to Marxism, which blew my mind. But so we'll have to take his word for it. But I think the way I think about it is like, I agree with you. The right, just in America at least, I don't know about forever hates the left, and they're just responding to the left.
Yeah, so hate is too strong. But antipathy. The word antipathy, I think, is underused. There's a lot of people are accused of hating something when really it's just like, well, I don't hate it.
Sure.
It's just
some kind of negative emotionality towards the left. Yes. And then with the left is, the way I think about what the left wants, I think, what do they get most emotional about? Like, what do they attack people for? What do they, will they physically assault you for, or try to get you fired? And it's not the person who's the most free market. It's the person who's ever on the furthest scale of being the most racist or sexist or homophobic. So that's why I don't see the market.
Although that's fairly contingent to today's leftists in certain countries. So, it's not a general theory of leftists in general.
Yeah, but why do we need general theory? Are these we just
we're social scientists? We love to get a big theory that explains everything all at once.
But it seems like we're taking these labels and like, can you make something in common between today's debates, the critical race theory, and like fascism versus communism, and like maybe and maybe not, or maybe we're just stretching and trying to find something there.
All right, one of your most famous pieces argues the left is succeeding because their cardinal preferences are more intense. Could you walk us through your story, hold our hands, and make sure we understand every piece?
Yeah. Okay. So, like in an election, basically people vote, and that's ordinal preferences, right? I prefer candidate X to candidate Y, and in those terms, America is pretty evenly divided. Republicans and Democrats both get at the national level roughly half the votes in presidential elections. Maybe one gets, usually Democrats win the popular vote, but it's very close. But basically every institution in the country not every institution, every major non-religious institution leans left, right? If they comment on like racial issues, or they comment on something regarding gender or sexual orientation, it's always the left-wing position. And so this is woke capital, woke institutions. And I think this can be explained by the fact that, look, on election day everyone is equal, but the other 364 days of the year we're not equal. Some of us think about politics a lot and do a lot to try to influence institutions and government, and some of us just go watch a football game or hang out with the family or whatever. And a series of sort of different pieces of evidence converge on the same idea that liberals just care about politics.
And that would be a cardinal preference.
That would be cardinal. How much you care about politics relative to everything else, on planet Earth. And so, like, what's the evidence for this? Liberals are more likely to, sign petitions, more likely to protest. That's just nobody. I don't think anyone needs data to believe that. More likely to cut off, people in their lives over political
more likely
views.
to donate money to political causes as well, right?
Yes. Well, this is relatively recent. So if you just look at, I don't know about all causes, but as far as we have good data on Republicans versus Democrats in national elections, and especially since the Trump era, from regular donors, yes, Democrats have outraised Republicans by a lot. And then I think also like going into fields like journalism and academia, which aren't the most financially remunerative for someone's intelligence and education level, those attract overwhelming leftists. It's not just the bias of these fields or whatever. So you put that all together. I mean, there's a simple theory which is just liberals care more, and this can explain liberal institutions being liberal.
This is a case of care more about politics, not care more about people.
Care more about politics. Now, you can have the most negative or the most positive interpretation of that. They can be just they love the world and they want to make it better, or they have something missing in their lives and they want to just tell people what to do. Yeah, either way works.
So the reason why people at your cell phone store have to go through mandatory left-wing brainwashing is the cardinal preferences of the left are stronger. Is that the story?
Yes, I think that basically if you have if a corporation takes a right-wing position on something, I have another essay on civil rights law. This is another Gabe Rossman from UCLA. He summarized my argument good. Civil rights law is basically a force amplifier for the left. But just setting that aside, the fact is, if you look at what happened with Chick-fil-A.
What did happen with Chick-fil-A? I haven't been following it.
Well, that was like a decade ago.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. So what was the final outcome?
The final outcome was basically they backed. So the guy who the owner of Chick-fil-A was basically anti-gay marriage. He donated to anti-gay marriage causes. Liberals boycotted Chick-fil-A. They protested Chick-fil-A. There was basically even some cities like trying to kick them out of the airport. And the final outcome was basically he gave up and said he's not going to donate. I don't know if he officially said this, but he stopped donating, caring about the issue at all. And there's nothing stopping conservatives from. Well, now it's hard because every corporation, you'd have to do it to every corporation. But when this was starting, there there wasn't any reason why conservatives couldn't similarly have cared. I was seeing there was some outdoor. I remember there was some outdoor brand in Wisconsin or Wyoming or Montana, one of these states, and it was the liberals had pressured them into taking some left wing position, and those liberals were probably were certainly a small minority of Wyoming, the state, or whatever. Yeah. The area, and they just still had more influence. And this is, I think, the most normal human beings do not will buy the product that they like and not care about the politics of the CEO. The minority that does is going to have an outsized influence, and I think that explains a lot.
So my main criticism of your original piece is that you need discrimination law, not just asymmetric cardinal preferences, to explain the sheer uniformity of leftist influence. Since then, you already mentioned that piece. It seems like you've moved in my direction. Have you?
I think they're complementary theories. I think there's a force amplifier. I think liberals care more. I think that and the law is basically, especially on anything having to do with race, gender, and sexual orientation, it's basically got its thumb on the scale. Some left wing dogma. It's funny, we debate the causes of differences between men and women or different races, in journals and magazines, but legally, as a business, you're only allowed to believe in one thing, which is that underrepresentation is caused by discrimination at some level.
Yeah, the thought experiment I sometimes think about is, imagine if there were a business, a middling prominent corporation that just had a pile of propaganda all over saying this is a colorblind workplace.
Yeah,
we do. So please avoid any discussion of such issues, and also this is a place where everyone is treated fairly. And then it is known that if you start complaining and saying that people that you are being treated unfairly, that people say, well, you are going against the company. This is not our way here. So, and just imagine the legal exposure of a company like that if they were to be that forthright.
Yeah, it's not just that the government is reactive. The government forces businesses and institutions to take affirmative steps to count people, people by race and gender. So the race and sex blindness, are for all practical purposes illegal. And this is and government contractors and their subcontractors, and that's every major corporation, are required to practice affirmative action. And I think these essays were part of a trilogy. So I think these are complementary theories. I think another essay I could write, or I hint at it in those, is that basically the fact that liberalism I think gives people a more more consistent sort of, it can appeal to idealistic people because it has a more consistent narrative. Most conservatives, if you ask them what's the cause of group differences, so put it this way, if you ask liberals what the cause of group differences, I think what they say in private and what they say in public is pretty much the same thing. They think it's discrimination. I think if you ask most conservatives why they think some groups earn more than others, you get wildly different explanations.
Or sometimes just denial, like we're all the same now.
Yeah,
like what?
Or they avoid talking about it. Yes, because they don't want to say why. So that has short-term political. People do it for a reason. That has short-term political benefits, but also like prevents you from having a coherent narrative that can motivate a lot of people.
Would you generalize your cardinal preference theory to explain, for example, why radical Islam punches above weight?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, someone's going to come chop off your head if you say the wrong thing is is an incentive to.
So there's a lot of countries that seem to be ruled by radical Islamists. Does not mean that the typical person there actually wants to chop off heads. It's just that the people that don't want to chop off heads are not as vehement about the non-chopping off of heads as the people who want to chop heads off are about the chopping of heads. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I mean, and the willingness. I mean, look at the willingness to actually suffer great consequences for your beliefs. I mean, you look at some of you have these repressive governments in the Middle East, and like nobody is basically willing to nobody was basically an activist against Saddam Hussein or hating the government from within the country, except basically religious extremists. And you could see why religion would give people the courage that they otherwise wouldn't have. So yes, absolutely. I think that's the secret of Islamism. And this is why sort of like when people say, oh, the woke are gonna, they're gonna inspire a backlash and it's gonna be self-defeating, or they could say the same thing about Islamic extremists. Like maybe they get a bunch of the passive majority to dislike them, but with a small minority that really cares, you can indefinitely influence policy in your direction. So don't rely on the backlash.
Yeah, so you've argued that critical race theory bans will not work. Could you explain your argument and the extent to which you subsequently changed your mind?
The critical race theory bans, you basically come down, the state says you're not going to teach, critical race theory, and sometimes they define it, and this has been a hot thing. I mean, a lot of states have done this now, and my argument is basically my argument when I wrote the Substack piece was basically that you're still going to get people. Basically, it's still the same left-wing people running the institutions, right? The people who thought it was a good idea to teach, kindergartners that, they have white privilege are still the same people who are going to teach your kids. And you can't, micromanage to any large extent exactly what they're going to say. Now, I've had a little bit of, I think I've actually listened to the people who are critics of these bans, and in my mind, they made the case for them because what they say is there's a chilling effect. So people are going to, they're going to just not want to talk about racism in the classroom at all if there's potential consequence. And I say, good, we overemphasize racism as an explanatory force in American life. So if you're going to chill something, and you have to chill something, chill the idea that all disparities are caused by discrimination, which I think is wrong.
Right, and plus these are little kids, so normally we're supposed to sugarcoat things for little kids. Even if it were true that racism were the main or a terrible thing in our society, you wouldn't normally go and try to terrify children about it. You don't go to kids and say, yes, murder. Yes. There's lots of murder happening in the United States. Let's talk about murder. Right? It was like, these are children. Most people want to shelter them for a while.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I think, and actually, when Trump did the executive order banning the critical race theory trainings in the federal government, they were all over Twitter saying, I've had 10 government contracts canceled. Like, where does this fascism? And I was like, okay, Trump was good for something. Something worked. It gave me, and people, I've talked to people in the Trump administration who say basically, I mean, there was just like ridiculous stuff that was in the works and just didn't go forward because of the executive order. So I think creating I think understanding how the left was effective, basically, often creating a chilling effect, expanding definitions of things like racism just used to mean like you were a Klansman, and now it means basically everyone who's not a far leftist. I think doing that in reverse, could be useful, could be beneficial.
Yeah, so you already touched on this a little bit, but let's go in deeper. You seem impressed by the connection between leftism and mental illness. Could you explain the evidence and tell us what it means?
This is look up Zach Goldberg's work. He has some Twitter threads and he has a Substack, and he has other things in the works on this. Yeah, I mean, if you ask people if they've been diagnosed for a mental illness, and it's particularly left-wing women. I don't know if it's just white women, but left-wing women in particular.
High education left-wing women, or all left-wing women?
I think it holds all. I mean, I think the correlation between liberalism and mental illness. Now, I actually, I wonder which way the correlation goes, and some people will say they're more likely to be diagnosed
to medicalize their problems.
Yeah, they're more likely to medicalize their problems. Yeah, I mean that potentially could be that
trouble right winger talks to a priest, trouble left winger talks to a psychiatrist.
Yeah, so actually I don't know if Zach has done that. I've talked to Zach about this, and I either he told me the work was done or he wanted to go do it, but basically to see whether if you control for having visited a psychiatrist, and then you could say whether you've been diagnosed. But I actually think medicalization of your problems, I think, is a sign of something going wrong. I don't think we've become mentally healthier as a society as we've done more of that. But actually, also the other thing that Zach says is if you ask people specific symptoms, not only have you been diagnosed with a mental illness, but have you felt so angry you could scream? I don't know. That's not the exact question, but stuff like that. And you do get many, many more self-reported symptoms. Now you could say maybe conservatives just hide it from themselves, but you have to keep sort of building on the theory to explain away the data that seems to point in a consistent direction.
But anyone would be horrified in this horrible world if they had any common decency, right?
I mean, not necessarily. I mean, your feelings are your feelings. I mean, they're the world has a certain
leftists are people who appreciate the horror of the world, and right wingers are colorblind to the horror of the world. That could be,
I mean, potentially, right? I mean, I don't think there is a objective answer to how happy you should be given the state of the world, right? I don't think the world sucks, so therefore you should be miserable. I don't know if that makes it better, right? Does that follow?
Right. All right. So how bad is wokeism compared to Marxism-Leninism in its heyday?
Oh, I mean, come on, Marxism.
Yes.
It's not a fair comparison.
Yeah. My next question is the analogy absurd hyperbole or what?
So I think
absurd hyperbole or just regular hyperbole?
It's hyperbole. I think that it's regular hyperbole. If you're thinking about problems today, and sometimes I even think that I look at the anti-woke people on the left, and they're saying don't focus on, even if you're just looking at today, forget the historical baggage of Marxism-Leninism, and they say things like we should not focus on race, we should focus on class. And I often think that's probably worse. I mean, your race you didn't choose, so you're punishing people for things they didn't choose. But your socioeconomic status depends on your hard work and intelligence. So instead of
also your parents,
so punishing people for things that are good.
Yeah. Communist regimes throw you in jail, or worse, because your parents were rich. So you're the son of a nobleman. Siberia for you.
Yeah, but I mean, modern leftists
or North Korea. If you got the wrong ancestry, you're a permanent unperson in North Korea.
In practical effects, if you want to equalize even opportunity of outcome, you have to punish people for having good parents, right? You have to somehow break the connection between the parents' actions and the outcomes of the children. So this is a horrifying thing.
All right. Now this question's a bit harder, but let's try it anyway. All right. Holding skill constant, what economists would call marginal productivity, or what industrial psychologists would call job performance. In what year did or will the net effect of being white on career success become negative? So what's the first year where it actually became bad to be white for your career success in the United States, holding your skill constant?
I think that it depends on sort of the industry and the field.
But randomly selected person, is it bad to be white now?
A randomly selected person to be white.
Worker.
I think probably non-white is better.
But what year was the crossing point where it actually became disadvantageous to be white?
So are you controlling for example, the blacks had they tended to be in the rural South, right? And they tended to live there. And so if they were worse off because of that, would you say that that's because of
holding skill constant? So if being in a rural area,
a black in Chicago of the same skills as a white person in Chicago in
all the things that would be in a usual wage regression.
Yeah, I mean, I think once you eliminate all that, I mean, I think it was probably, so I think that, for the median person who was not working a white collar job, and most people were, most people are not college graduates. I think the labor unions basically had exclusionary, they were excluding blacks, and they were excluding, there was basically family and people, And so if you think that's closer to the median worker than, say, being a professor, I think being a black professor versus a white professor in the field was probably the 50s. I'm sure, was probably at least by the 60s for sure. But if you're thinking the median blue collar worker, that probably is, maybe switches in the 80s. I don't know. Like if I have to put a date on it.
So unions cause systemic racism.
Yeah, I would say so. But even those unions, like if you're saying, it's not like the, a white person with no connections would also be sort of, hurt there. So yeah, I think it's, I think for like our circles, I mean, I think the disadvantage to being white was came much sooner and is much more extreme than it is in other fields.
All right, same question, but this time for males. What year did it first become disadvantageous for your career to be male?
So for your career.
Or again, of course, it's possible that you'll say it's in the future and it's going to happen. It's totally up to you.
So when did it become disadvantageous to be male? So is it,
skill constant, holding skill constant.
Strength. So we're imagining
all labor, all occupationally relevant skills.
So for the woman who is as strong as the average, or somebody who is in between men and women.
Yes, you'd have to imagine that a woman who's just as good at lifting furniture, if that's a job, but you'd also, but of course this would also be picking stocks in a hedge fund or but everything in between. So the holding skill. I mean, the holding skill constant is because I know that's what makes it fun.
They're so different. So I think that if you had a woman in the 1960s who acted like a typical stockbroker, I don't think that would have gone over well. I think people would have thought that was weird. I think by the 1970s and 80s, now, given that you're a woman and you have those inclinations, by the time you're protected with anti-discrimination laws, which go beyond even the Civil Rights Act, I think you're better off. Now, if you're just a typical office drone and you have the same skills, right? I mean, maybe you did have an advantage because men, it depends on what you look like too. I mean, men probably discriminate in favor of pretty women and discriminate against ugly women relative to men. So it's just a very complicated question.
All right, how about same question for straight? When did or will it become disadvantageous for your career to be straight?
I mean, are we holding? So are we holding constant?
Hold productivity constant.
The homosexual man who has a relationship with his partner in the way that a heterosexual man.
Totally out of the closet. When did it start to be? When did or will it become better for him, for his career, to be openly gay?
So I think I buy into the more of the idea that it's disadvantage to be gay even today. So I'm not that old. I was in high school in like the late 1990s, and there was maybe one or two gay kids. And if you heard someone was gay, you hated that person.
I remember that in the 80s.
So that was before. Yes. So this was not mine. Was more recent. And so this was about the and so like
that's right. You did not grow up in California. You were in Chicago, so it's not quite as shocking.
Yeah, and so even forget about the overinterpretation of anti-discrimination. Until recently, there wasn't even a federal. The courts made it, but there wasn't even a federal anti-discrimination law against homosexuality. So I would say probably today it's still advantageous to be straight. Now again, academics, PC, journalism, maybe politics in certain areas. Then
all right, same question, but for cisgendered.
You're still listen. There's so much else going on when you're transgendered. I refuse to control for a variety of that stuff.
All right. Okay. So, to what extent do you accept the Beckerian view that market forces tend to eliminate taste-based discrimination?
Why do they eliminate taste-based discrimination?
Because if you are refusing to hire people who are just as qualified because you don't like their group, then you are leaving money on the table, and if you won't hire them, the competition will.
But I mean, at the same time, people have preferences. So that would say people do care about who they're around, and it's just an empirical question, the strength of their preferences on these things, right?
Right. So you say you're skeptical of that, or you think that's again, this is the real world question. So how powerful is this mechanism in the real world according to Richard Hanania?
So I think if you're talking about one industry, I think you can have discrimination indefinitely. When you have something like an open market where if people are rejected from X and they have still the same amount of intelligence and the same amount of family, a healthy family life and ability, and they can go into Y field like ethnic groups who are talented have done throughout history. Then I think at the I don't think taste-based discrimination would explain would go far to explain differences between groups and how they're doing socioeconomically. Can it explain one field or one industry? Yeah, absolutely.
All right, now let's get a little wonkish here. So economists distinguish between taste-based discrimination, where you just go, ooh, yuck, I don't like those people, I don't want to hire them, and statistical discrimination, where you say, no, I have perfectly normal feelings towards them. It's just that statistically they have some traits, and it's just too much work for me to figure out what's going on. The most obvious example would be, why do auto insurance companies charge higher premiums to young males? They probably don't have a dartboard with a bunch of teenage males on it where they go, God, I hate them. I hate young males so much. They're terrible. Instead, it is you've got some actuaries at the insurance company saying, well, statistically, these young males get into 50% more accidents than young women, and so we're going to go and charge them higher premiums. So anyway, so we got taste-based discrimination, we got statistical discrimination. My question for you is, over the last 60 years in the U.S. labor market, what has happened to the ratio of taste-based to statistical discrimination?
So the statistical discrimination is very interesting. So Tom Sowell says basically when he was in the army, and he was like, I don't know what he was doing. He was like, he knew something about cameras, and when people saw he was like, he had some technical skill, they were impressed. A black guy, with all his disadvantages, had that, and people don't think like that anymore because we understand there's massive affirmative action, right? And so I think there's probably the more we make statistical discrimination more rational, the more of it there is. So if we're promoting people based on their skin color or their gender, the more the heavier they go on affirmative action, the heavier you should go on statistical discrimination. Just that's common sense. So I think there's more of it. There might have been statistical discrimination, holding skills constant, all that. There might have been more. So there might have actually gone in the opposite direction in certain cases. And then taste-based discrimination. I think this has changed. At least social, what people say they want has changed over time. But you also, if you look at like interracial marriage, right, that has gone up. So it does seem like we are. Yeah, it does seem like we are. People are becoming less discriminating less based on race and their taste. The most unregulated thing is who people date and marry. So yeah, I think that's going in the opposite direction.
All right. Moving back to foreign policy a little bit, to what extent are you anti-Putin?
So I'm very anti-Putin. Yes, I think that we sit there and we sit there and we say, okay, this guy is doing bad. So the question is not. I think the foreign policy hawks want the question to be is whether Saddam Hussein is they want a referendum on Saddam Hussein's personality or Putin's personality, and they want you not to think too hard when they say Putin did X. Okay, Putin poisoned some journalist. Now let's go defend Ukraine. Okay, well, the connection between A and B, is not really there. But I think they understand something intuitively, psychologically, that if you can get somebody to hate Putin or hate Saddam, you're just going to do whatever seems anti-Putin or anti-Saddam, whether it's connected to any rational goal in the real world. So anti-Putinism and anti-Shiism, anti-Shiism, Xi Jinping, not Shiism, anti-Iran, sentiment. I think these are harmful to our politics, and I think they short circuit rational thinking.
Yeah, so I am no fan of Putin myself, but definitely if in 1980 you had told me that he would be the leader of the former Soviet Union, say, wow. It's like not that bad. It's like it goes from being a horrible totalitarian despot to a guy who's like a normal authoritarian dictator. Big improvement.
Yeah. So actually, I mean, like the last 2 years with lockdowns, I mean, has really made me not very sympathetic to the view that there are these authoritarian regimes, and they're much worse than us democracies, right? I care a lot more about showing my face in public than I do my right to vote. And Russia and Belarus have had less, restrictions during COVID than a lot of Western democracies, especially in places like Australia. So I have no patience for their democracy. They're non-democracies. They're bad. I think we've gone so overboard with COVID, been so neglectful of individual rights and liberty and cost-benefit analysis that there is a moral equivalency, or in some ways, we've been worse.
I mean, there's also the question of, well, who do you think would would be ruling the Russia if not for Putin?
I think that's
and like who would that? What would that guy be like?
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, I'm pretty. I can. I feel comfortable condemning Bush because if Bush wasn't president, if it was say Gore, I think the American foreign policy would have been a lot better, and a lot of fewer people would have died. If Putin was replaced by the median outcome, if you replace Putin, I'm not sure things would be better.
Will there be a day when we say, "Wow, things weren't so bad under Putin"?
Yeah, I mean, this is why it's hard enough to make these moral judgments in your own country, and I don't like this this idea that you could put everyone on a democracy scale, or we could say this person's bad, and you have to look at their context, you have to look at their circumstances. I'm allergic to this sort of morality tale understanding of international politics.
All right, so same question except anti-Orban.
So I'm anti-Orban even more so. I think that Orban is actually I don't think Hungary is less free than other European countries.
What about all the newspapers he shut down?
He didn't shut down. I mean, he didn't shut down newspapers. It's
basically that's not true.
No, it's basically like his. They say things like, well, it's basically their complaints are more along the lines of like, they stopped government funding to a newspaper that needed government funding to survive, or that Orban's friends had bought some newspaper that was anti-Orban before, which is like people's friends buy news. I mean that happens in Western countries. I'll tell you one thing Hungary doesn't do, which is put people in the jail for their opinions, which France and Germany and Sweden actually do. I mean, they do arrest people for hate speech, and the reason that's not considered anti-democratic is because it's more of a left-wing kind of totalitarianism. So I think it's a narrative. I think it's a narrative. I think people don't like Orban because he's right-leaning, right? Because of his views on immigration, gender, sexuality, things like that. And I think that they call that anti-democratic, and that's how they understand who is anti-democratic in the U.S. too. So I don't buy the Orban is undemocratic narrative.
All right, and same question again, except for Xi or Xi, as you called him, of China. Anti-Xi.
Same thing. Probably what I say about Putin. I mean, it's it's a. They want the referendum to be like, is this person a good person or not? And that's like not a guide to American foreign policy. It can inform your understanding of American foreign policy, but I think a lot of people want that to be the conversation. And I just have such an aversion to that.
All right, moving on. Were you a COVID dub from the start or only after the vaccine became available?
After the vaccine. Now, if you give me my information now and put me back to the start, I would have probably been close to a dove from the start. Then this is based on what Philippe Lemoine has done and basically shown it's hard. You have to squint very hard to see any effect of any restriction on COVID transmission or deaths, right? And so given the costs of the lockdowns, it's the burden is on, those who would take away people's rights and destroy the economy to prove that they're doing something. I do not hold it against anybody who was more of a COVID hawk at the beginning because there was so much we didn't know, and we didn't know how effective the NPIs were or even how dangerous COVID would be. But then as the evidence came in that the NPIs, and that's non-pharmaceutical interventions, that means everything besides vaccines, so like shutdowns, mask mandates, everything else.
Antivirals we count also.
As pharmaceutical, that's pharmaceutical.
Yes. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So, as the evidence came in that there was no strong relationship between these policy choices and outcomes, and as the vaccine got risk down significantly by orders of magnitude, I started to think not only have we overreacted, but this is the biggest policy disaster of my lifetime. And I've become just, very, just very sort of, it's really shaped my politics in sort of a profound way because I've just been shocked that we're still doing, things like mask mandates for children.
So many people blame China for failing to properly contain COVID. I blame China for making draconian policies popular in the West.
Yeah.
Who is right?
So as far as China not controlling COVID or not being honest, I mean, Philippe Lemoine, again, I'll reference him. He had a 4-part series in Colette, which I think really takes this down. So it takes this narrative apart. But I think you make a good point in that if this had not started in China, would we have gone to lockdowns? Because we saw what China did, and it made what we did in the West seem like not even that extreme. If this had started in Mexico and this disease was everywhere, would we have done that? And I think probably not. I mean, we needed that example of somebody else doing something. And I think you're right. We can blame China for that. But if our government was as competent as China. They had a few months a few months warning, and we let it get out of control. So if everyone was like China got down to zero COVID, it would have been solved. But yeah, blame them for giving us bad ideas about what we should do given our capabilities.
All right. Next question. What do you really think about immigration, Richard Hanania?
I think immigration is generally, it's a positive for the United States. I mean, I think that when you walk around, I think immigrants tend to participate in the real economy. And I think some people I think Milton Friedman was in favor of illegal immigration because, they didn't have to suffer from minimum wage laws and, other kinds of government regulations were mostly harmful. But you see immigrants tend to start businesses. They have a disproportionate share of pens. Even the low skilled immigration, listen, if you have children, you don't want to hire an American nanny. Okay, an American who's working as a nanny, there's often, let's just say you would be less comfortable leaving your children around them, leaving your children with them than a foreigner. So yeah, I think a lot of the anti-immigration people are like, they believe in family formation and stuff. Actually, I think I think that immigrants are actually good for that. So I don't know if I go as far as you, but I generally have a positive view of immigration.
Yes, in case you haven't heard, I do have a book called Open Borders, The Science and Ethics of Immigration. So, of course, if it did not be as extreme as me, it was not saying all that much because almost no one's as extreme as me. All right. What are your top complaints about the American left? Top complaints.
Top complaints is
just let it all out, Richard.
I think we've got into it.
Give them hell, Richard.
So the COVID restrictions, I've told you, I'm basically like a one issue person, voter / citizen at this point. I think we need to show our faces. I don't care about anything else really at this point. So yes, the hysteria. I mean, the wokeness. I mean, that's something that's I've elaborated on already. The anti-market stuff too. I guess. What else is there left from the left? I guess that's most things.
All right. Now, what are your top complaints about the American right?
I think, the foreign policy is probably the worst thing. I don't think they have, an intellectual vision to push back on the right. I think they've been irresponsible in sort of the anti-vaccine rhetoric, and they'll say not anti-vaccine, anti-mandates. But look, if you just focus on one mandate for one thing all the time, right? I mean, that's a pretty, you're sending a message and you're doing it pretty openly. Often I am, even if I agree with the right, it's sort of like, the way sort of right wingers argue is often just, it reflects it just so clearly reflects the fact that they're driven by antagonism. You look at the headlines on a conservative site, Biden did this, Fauci did this. This is my article, liberals read, conservatives watch TV, just the extent to which it's personalized. And like, it's, for good reason. I have many problems with the left, but it doesn't mean, any reaction to that is healthy.
Yeah, so the right is not very strong on having any concrete solution for anything they're complaining about. It's more of just saying, look at how terrible they are. All right, my job's done.
Yeah. Well, that's like the foreign policy thing. Putin, Xi, bad, right? That's all you need to know. But although there are, people who are thinking about this. So Chris Rufo is, thinking about this and doing things. And then there was, I was encouraged to see in City Journal some sort of responses to my, and building upon my article, Woke Institutions is Just Civil Rights Law by Charles Layman and another one by Gabe Rossman. So, there are people thinking about that, and the extent to which they do more of that, the better.
Yeah, Joe, or just another example. So I've been pushing the idea of a free speech exception to discrimination law such that you are not allowed to present any evidence on any political or comments or jokes that a person gave on the job.
Yeah.
Right. And that's just barred from any case. And if you can't make a case without talking about jokes, then you don't have a case.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So the federal government is in the business of regulating humor. I mean, that's what you're getting at. And at least, it seems like an easy political sell to say that they shouldn't be doing that.
All right. How strong is left-wing bias in K through 12 really?
I think back to like my own experience, and we talked a lot about civil rights. We talked a lot about historical racism, and it's like I don't even remember much from actually elementary school. Like I can't even remember if it was a left-wing bias or a right-wing biase.
And you think it's very different now, or you think it's probably the same?
I mean, hopefully, the optimistic case, people aren't even paying attention and they're not digesting anything. I think, maybe they overreached with this recent stuff, and that's why you get the critical race theory bans, because they made it so obvious, like nobody can miss, what they're doing. But no, I think that, I tweeted about the other day the Cars movies. Have you seen the Cars movies?
I saw the first one.
Okay, so basically the Cars movies, the lesson of the first one is basically, neoliberalism is basically bad, right? Because you have this,
the sponsored car. Yes.
You have the left behind sort of radiator space.
Oh yeah, that's right.
And then I won't give away the spoilers, I think, for those who still want to watch a Cars movie. But Cars 2 is about global warming, basically, and Cars 3 brings in a girl and has her overcome something, right? So I think, like, if you look at the Cars movie, I think you're sort of, that's like I think you're just like looking at children's movies and you're looking at sort of what is the normie narrative of like what good people are supposed to believe, right? And it reflects different, like there's 2006 and a 2011 version and like a 2016, whatever the Cars movies are released. I'm just thinking about Cars movies because I just recently watched them. But maybe I'm putting too much stock in them.
They're on everyone's mind.
but I think that's the, like, most people don't think most people don't think markets are good. And, it's like, it's really not like, I don't think this is like, I don't think it's like impossible to like convince people like on a technical basis that like something that intuitively seems bad might actually be good. Like getting in a plane is intuitively very scary, but like we teach people that it's like, okay, and you're probably going to be fine. So I think the anti-market bias, could be done away with. But to me, like a neutral understanding of politics would mean saying, look, markets are really, really great. To me, that's the accurate understanding of human history. And they definitely don't get that. So yeah, there's a bad left-wing bias.
So how strong is left-wing bias in the typical state university in America?
Pretty bad. I mean,
there's a lot worse than K-12.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have entire fields that are sort of, empirical, unfalsifiable. I mean, women's studies, African American studies, we have like a race, ethnicity, and politics subfield within political science. And it's, you can look at the, you could just look up, papers in this field. Yeah, it's pretty bad. And even the people who are like not obviously crazy on this space are doing stuff like drawing democracy charts where whenever there's a right-wing government, it's falling, it's collapsing. So it's pretty bad, unquestionably.
All right. How strong is left-wing bias in top universities?
It's the same. I mean, a lot of these people.
Same, not worse.
No, it's worse. It's worse. Yeah. So like your typical state school. I mean, I've, my experience has been, just being around a few campuses, and, so definitely, the most left-wing campus I was on, probably UCLA and CU Boulder. U Chicago less. And so it depends on the elite school. Like I think Princeton and U Chicago are better than the typical state school, and then something like
you consider Princeton better than typical state school?
Well, from what I've heard, I've never been to Princeton. I don't know much, but from what I've heard, and I've seen survey data that they're more Republican than others. I don't know. I'm just making things up basically out of Princeton. I know Chicago better, so yeah, Chicago at least is better. At least was when I was there. And then something like the all girls liberal arts colleges Northeast are probably the most extreme end of that. Yeah, we actually have data on this. That there are ones where it's 99% would consider them on the left. We have fine grained data at CSPI that we're going to go through soon. And yeah, you'll see the Northeast liberal arts female schools are the worst in terms of political bias.
So top universities' endowments have skyrocketed during COVID. Does this mean we should expect them to stay on their current ideological trajectory for decades to come?
So what are the details of the endowment, because the stock market has been doing well?
Yeah, so the main universities that I know of, at least, at minimum stayed in the market the whole time and then realized immense capital gains. And I think some of the better ones might have actually even market time successfully.
So they're just basically, people say about Harvard, it's basically a hedge fund with like a university attached to it.
That's right.
And the endowments are absolutely large. Yeah. So there's so much,
Harvard, I'm not sure. I mean, Harvard could have easily gained another $10 billion off of this whole thing.
And so you have and so there's they're self-financing, but they're self-financing based on government money because of the aid and the student loans and the grants and everything else. So yeah, I mean it's It seems I don't see anything that's going to necessarily on the horizon that will knock them off the path that they're on now. And it seems like it's been getting more extreme in the last year or two. You know, there are more attacks on like standardized tests and things like that. You know, the one objective thing that's left in the admissions process. So yeah, it's by all indications things are going to get worse.
All right, you practically started answering my next question. Most top schools seem like they're going to be test optional from now on. How much and how soon will this damage the value of the signal of a degree from a top school?
Yeah,
when do people start saying Harvard? They let in, like their students are dummies.
You know, it depends on the sort of the implementation will be very interesting. So it will be optional. If you're a white male with a high test score, I'm guessing you should probably you still probably send it in 10 years to Harvard. If you are a black female liberal activist and you have slow SATs, you probably don't want to show them the SATs and you want to show them the other things. So I think you're going to get more selection for left-wing activism, but I still think the median student might still be pretty close because, they'll have, 50% will percent in their SATs and they might even be higher on average than before just because fewer are submitting them. And so the signal might still work, but then you'd have to apply, I guess, more statistical discrimination against the groups getting affirmative action. So the implementation is going to be very interesting. And I guess the question is how much of it, how much is it, how much do like objective market, forces, based on, signals of productivity, and how much are employers just, being conformist and, complying with civil rights law and, having other behavior that doesn't really make perfect sense from like, a grand, perspective of economic efficiency. It's a complicated question. It's going to be interesting to find out.
Yeah, I'll confess I was completely shocked by how this test optional thing played out. When I first heard about it, my reaction was this will get them a lot more applications, then they'll assume the worst of everyone who didn't have test scores and reject them. Yeah. And actually top schools, a large percentage, 40-50% of the students they took didn't actually send in their test scores. Yeah. So like, all right, man, so you actually believe this stuff. It's not just that you're pretending to have lower standards in order to go and get more applications in order to raise your U.S. News and World Report ranking, which is a classic bait and switch from top schools. So pretty surprising. All right, last question. Do any of your inherited identities matter to you at all? And if so, which ones and why?
Not really. I mean, I'm a Middle Eastern Christian. I'm not, particularly enamored by Middle East politics. People often ask my opinion on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I have no particular, emotional attachment to, either side or that conflict at all. And then, I guess the other identity would be American. And, I have a very, it's very funny because, I have these petty preferences that, where the American identity comes out strong. But then, on big questions, is the American system superior to other systems? I'm skeptical, but then it's is football better than soccer? And and then I come to yes, whoever likes soccer is a weirdo and a wimp, and whoever likes football is a real man and psychologically healthy. So it comes out in sort of strange ways, but yeah, I mean that's not so much for political or more serious issues.
All right, this has been a fascinating, thrilling interview with Richard Hanania. And I guess last question is, where can everyone who is dying to find out more of what you have to say hear about it?
Yeah, to make it easy for people to find me, or maybe out of laziness, my Twitter handle is just Richard Hanania, and my Substack is just richardhanania.substack.com. So, find me there.
All right, this is Bryan Caplan signing off from the Salem Center at the University of Texas here in the beautiful and free air of Austin. Looks like you got one last thing you want to say, Richard.
I should have said also CSPIcenter.org, Center for Study of Partisanship Ideology, and then cspi.substack.com. On our mailing list, you'll get not just my work, but everyone else's work involved with it.
Oh, last question. There's a rumor that you're thinking of moving to Austin. No comment?
No comment for now.
All right. Thank you very much, Richard. And signing off, thank you, Salem Center listeners. Goodbye.
Thank you.